Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Tonight, we listen to a calm retelling of The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft from 1928. A story about knowledge that is better left hidden, and about the unsettling realization that the world is far larger and stranger than we are able to comprehend. The greatest mercy of mankind, I believe, is its inability to correlate all its contents. We live on a quiet island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. This thought returns to me again and again as I began to sort through the papers of my late great-uncle. Professor Angel had been a sober man, a scholar, a linguist, free from superstition, and yet he had left me something that has not released its hold on me since. In a locked box, I found notes, sketches, and reports that at first glance appeared disconnected. There were accounts of strange dreams, reports of primitive cults, newspaper clippings about acts of violence and natural disasters that seemed to have nothing to do with one another. And yet, at the center stood a single word, repeated again and again, in different handwriting, in different contexts. Cthulhu. At first, I assumed it was all the product of an overactive imagination. My uncle had apparently interviewed an artist named Wilcox who spoke of nightmarish visions. Visions of gigantic cities of inhuman geometry, of beings older than the earth itself. I would have dismissed these things as curiosities had a pattern not begun to emerge. The deeper I immersed myself in the material, the clearer it became that these accounts had arisen independently, and yet described the same images, the same words. What disturbed me was not the content alone, but the objectivity with which my uncle had documented everything. He had drawn no conclusions, offered no judgments. He had collected, compared, and examined. And it was precisely this sobriety that gave the material a weight that could not be shaken off. It was as though he had recognized something he himself scarcely dared to accept. I began to understand that these papers did not tell of a single delusion, but of something deeper, something that ran like a dark thread through dreams, myths, and events. And as I read, I was seized by the feeling that I, too, had now become part of this knowledge, whether I wished it or not. The longer I studied my uncle's papers, the clearer it became that they were not a random collection of strange observations. They were the result of years of work, carefully organized and constantly expanded. My uncle had attempted to establish connections without committing himself prematurely, and it was precisely this restraint that made his notes so unsettling. One section of the records dealt with a secret cult that appeared in various parts of the world. My uncle had gathered reports from remote regions, from southern swamps, from isolated islands, from places that had little contact with the so-called civilized world. Everywhere there were references to rituals, to strange chants, and to a being whose name was spoken in different languages, yet always worshipped in the same way. Particularly disturbing was the uniformity of these reports. People who had never met one another described the same symbols, the same forms, the same dreams. They spoke of a sleeping power, of a time before time, of an awakening that would inevitably come. My uncle had not commented on these statements, merely recorded them. Yet in their accumulation there was a quiet urgency. I began to ask myself what had led him to take this research so seriously. Professor Angel was not a man easily impressed by myths. If he pursued these matters, it was not out of curiosity but out of concern. It was as though he had recognized a danger that did not reveal itself openly, but remained hidden. In dreams, in marginal notes, in the dark corners of the world. One report stood out in particular. It described a police raid on a secret gathering deep in the swamps. The account was sober, almost casual, and yet it evoked images that etched themselves into my mind. People there had worshipped beings whose description defied all known concepts, and they had done so not out of fear, but out of conviction. As I read, I felt my initial doubt slowly transform into unease. I began to grasp that this was not about fantasy or superstition, but about something that eluded our ordinary perception. My uncle had recognized this possibility, and perhaps it had been his undoing. The thought would not let me go. If these things were true, then the world as we knew it was only a thin surface, and beneath it lurked something that did not need to be discovered, something that waited patiently. After my uncle's death, I had initially reviewed his papers out of a sense of duty. By now, however, their content would not release me. I began to compare the individual reports, to search for temporal overlaps and geographical patterns, and the more I organized them, the more clearly a disturbing picture emerged. These phenomena were not isolated. They occurred simultaneously, independently of one another, and yet followed an inner logic. Especially striking was a series of reports about unusual dreams. People all over the world had dreamed at the same time of alien cities, of cyclopean architecture, and of beings that defied all known order. Artists, poets, ordinary laborers, all described the same forms, the same oppressive atmosphere, the same sense of something vast and indifferent. My uncle had not regarded these dreams as isolated incidents, but as symptoms. I began to understand that he had not been searching for a cult in the narrow sense. He was interested in something larger, a kind of mental disturbance that spread across humanity like a wave, as if something hidden had briefly signaled its presence. Not openly, not visibly, but on a level beyond conscious control. The deeper I delved into these thoughts, the harder it became to maintain distance. I caught myself paying attention to my own dreams, to fleeting images, to vague sensations as I fell asleep. Nothing concrete appeared, and yet a growing unease took hold. It was as though the mere engagement with these records had altered my perception. Another report dealt with a sailor who had been the sole survivor of a horrific event. The account was fragmentary, difficult to read, as if the man had scarcely been capable of putting what he had experienced into words. My uncle had preserved this report with particular care. He seemed to have seen in it a decisive piece of evidence. As I read these pages, it became clear to me that my uncle's investigations had moved ever further away from the academic world. He had gone to the margins of society, to people whose testimonies were usually ignored. And yet it was precisely there that the clues condensed. The thought that all this might be more than imagination began to take firm root within me. And with it grew the suspicion that my uncle had perhaps not died of illness, but of the knowledge he had gathered. The sailor's report would not leave me in peace. My uncle had read it several times, made notes, marked passages. I did the same. The man had described an expedition in the Pacific, a voyage that should have been nothing more than an ordinary sea journey. Yet it had culminated in something unimaginable. Part of the crew had vanished, others had gone mad, and only a few had survived. The description of the island they had encountered defied all known geography. The forms seemed wrong, as if they had not been shaped by the laws of nature. Walls rose at slanted angles into the sky. Corners appeared at once too large and too narrow, as though the human eye could not properly grasp them. The sailor had struggled to describe what he had seen and repeatedly emphasized that words were insufficient. Most disturbing was his account of a being that had risen from this alien city. He described it neither as an animal nor as a god, but as something third, beyond classification. A figure of unimaginable size, at once sluggish and threatening, whose mere presence exerted a paralyzing effect. The name the sailor gave was the same one that had long since become familiar to me from my uncle's papers. As I read, I was overcome by a feeling I could scarcely describe. It was not immediate fear, but a profound disturbance. The idea that such a thing could exist called everything I believed I knew about the world into question. Not because the being was hostile, but because it appeared utterly indifferent. Indifferent to humanity, to human life, and to human values. I now understood why my uncle had taken these reports so seriously. He had not been searching for monsters, but for the truth about our place in the universe. And that truth seemed far less comforting than we might wish. Humanity was not the center, not the measure of all things, but a casual detail within a much larger order. When I turned the last pages of the report, I noticed that my hands were trembling. I set the papers aside and gazed out the window for a long time. The world outside appeared unchanged, familiar, almost reassuring. And yet I knew that my view of it had shifted irrevocably. Something had entered my thinking that could no longer be driven away. The more I reflected on these events, the clearer it became that my uncle had not conducted his research alone. He had established contacts, exchanged ideas with people who had made similar observations. His notes revealed a network of letters, conversations, and encounters stretching over years. This had not been obsessive collecting, but a persistent search for confirmation. Particularly unsettling was the realization that many of these people had independently arrived at the same conclusions. All of them sensed that something vast, alien, and ancient existed in the background. Something that had not vanished, but merely slept. The world, it seemed, was only quiet because this power had not yet awakened. I began to understand that the cult described in the reports was not organized in the usual sense. It consisted of scattered groups united by shared knowledge. They did not believe in salvation or a better future. They merely waited for a moment when the order of the world would change. Their rituals were not pleas, but preparations. This thought filled me with a deep sense of dread. The idea that there were forces beyond human influence contradicted everything I had believed. Knowledge, progress, morality, all suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of a reality that lay beyond our control. I wondered whether my uncle had ultimately tried to suppress the truth. Perhaps he had hoped that the mere collection of evidence would suffice to contain the danger. Or perhaps he had recognized that knowledge does not necessarily grant power, but can instead become a burden. The more one understands, the heavier endurance becomes. In quiet moments, I felt the urge to burn the papers, to forget everything, and return to my former life. Yet this urge remained without effect. The knowledge could not be erased. It had taken hold, quietly but permanently. I now understood why my uncle had pursued this research for so long, not out of curiosity, but out of a sense of duty. And perhaps it was precisely this sense of duty that had ultimately brought him to his limit. With every further detail, my conviction grew that my uncle had come too close to a truth the human mind could scarcely endure. The reports he had gathered complemented one another like fragments of a picture that only became visible from a distance. Everywhere the same intuition, that beneath the visible world lay another, older, more powerful, and utterly indifferent to humanity. I began to understand that the fear gripping me did not arise from immediate danger, but from knowledge. It was not the being itself that shook me, but the idea that our civilization, our knowledge, and our order were only a thin veil. The thought would not release me that it might have been better never to recognize these connections. But now it was too late. The fragments had come together, and with them, my view of the world had changed. Everything familiar seemed more fragile, less secure. The certainty that humanity did not stand at the center of things, but at the edge of an incomprehensible reality, cast a shadow over my thinking. I knew that my uncle had carried this realization alone at the end, and that it must have broken him. After I had finished organizing my uncle's papers, I sat motionless for a long time. It was no longer fear that paralyzed me, but a deep exhaustion. The insights I had gained could not be undone. They had settled like a silent thought that could not be driven away. I now understood that my uncle had not died of madness, but of clarity. Of the clarity that humanity is not master of its world. I thought of everything we take for granted: order, progress, reason, and I realized how fragile these ideas are. They function only as long as we believe they form the center of reality. But my uncle's reports had shown something else. That there are forces which are neither old nor new, neither good nor evil, but simply are, indifferent to our striving, our hopes, and our morality. The decision not to publish the papers was not an easy one. Part of me wanted to warn, to explain, to speak the truth, but another part knew that truth does not always liberate, that once spoken, it cannot be taken back. Perhaps humanity's greatest protection lay precisely in not knowing everything, in not crossing every boundary. I understood that knowledge is a responsibility not everyone can bear. My uncle had borne it until it destroyed him. I would choose a different path, not out of cowardice, but out of insight. Some things must remain hidden, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too vast for human measure. Since then, I see the world with different eyes, not more hostile, not darker, but more humble. The certainty that we are only a small part of an immeasurable whole has taken deep root within me. And perhaps this is the final realization of this story, that our need for control is an illusion, and that sometimes it is wiser not to destroy that illusion. And with that, today's story comes to an end. A story about hidden knowledge, about human limits, and about the unsettling realization that there are truths better left undiscovered. Perhaps you are now wondering, what would it have meant for the world if this knowledge had become public? Is ignorance in this story a form of protection, or merely another kind of fear? And what does Lovecraft's tale reveal about the human drive to understand everything, even at the cost of one's own safety? We explore these and other questions in our accompanying book, Golden Pages, Volume 3. There you will also find the story again in written form, place it in its historical context, and show why the Call of Cthulhu is still regarded as one of the most powerful works about cosmic insignificance.